Hi, just testing the volume.
And then it's just here if people are saying we can't
It's
hear
too loud or
you.
too low.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh wait, so I'll project
I'm gonna
as though I'm
stay,
talking to him, but just wave
and
or
I'll
whatever.
stand.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Working? There we go. Can't make you all happy at all. So I'm doing a DPhil at the University of Oxford in philosophical theology. My focus is on anxiety and Kierkegaard's view of anxiety, which is obviously really relevant. Anxiety is very relevant today. So I'm constantly sharing my view on that, which is basically that anxiety is a divine invitation. It's an invitation to a new life that God is offering. So that's been really interesting. I live with my wife and 2 kids in Portland, Oregon, which is not a particularly Christian area, but a lot of anxiety there, and so that's always a interesting bridge into theology. I have a little ministry. We converted our garage into a British pub, basically. It's like a pub library thing, and I do kind of an outreach thing. It's called Philosophy Pub Night. People in Portland are not initially interested in religion, but very interested in philosophy, so that's also an interesting bridge. Let's see, I just had at Oxford, you basically defend your dissertation 3 times. I just had my second defense, which went well, and the assessor's only complaint was that there were too many chapters. They wanted me to get rid of a couple and just be done with it, so I'll probably oblige them. I will say, just kind of reflecting on, I wasn't able to attend last year, but since then, I just wanted to say, last night a lot of the fellows were sharing their experiences with regards to evangelism, and that is something that's just been on my heart for years. That's why we live in Portland, really. It's a place that needs Jesus really bad. And I've noticed a really interesting turn over the last few years. I really noticed it when I presented a paper on Kierkegaard and anxiety at a conference that I thought was just a Kierkegaard philosophy conference. It turned out to be a conference for PhDs in psychology. And so it was like, there were no Christians there except me. And so I presented this paper on Kierkegaard and how anxiety is Jesus inviting you to new life, better life. And after I presented, there was a postdoc there during QA, raised her hand and said, so you mentioned someone in your presentation, and I was like, Kierkegaard? And she's like, no. And I was thinking, the only other person I mentioned was Jesus. And so this was in Denmark, I should say. And I said, Jesus? And she's like, yeah, who? Kind of confused. And she's like, who's that? And I said, like in the Bible? And I didn't know if she was kidding or what. And I noticed that she was kind of embarrassed, and she was like, I'm sorry, I just wasn't raised with anything like that. Then I really realized what the term post-Christian means. Denmark is particularly post-Christian, but she was just fascinated, and she was like, what a beautiful story. I shared a little bit about the message of Jesus, and she was just like, wow, that is beautiful. She didn't really have much else to say. And I've noticed that also at Philosophy Pub Night. People are actually really hungry again, and they don't know much of the message anymore, which is just shocking. I think post-Christian actually means that people haven't been raised with this, and people are hungering for healing. In all different forms, but they're looking for their lives to become whole. And that's out there for the waiting. I see it all over the place. It's a lot different now than it was 10 years ago. But so that's been interesting. And the only other thing that my main struggle has really just been trying to find a good church home for our family. It's hard. We have a daughter that has Down syndrome and autism. She's nonverbal, and I know that the church wants to be welcoming and inviting, and the church wants to hear those with disabilities. The church wants to be that, but when the rubber meets the road, it's kind of like, and you actually have people with disability. Like our daughter, has pretty profound autism. When the rubber meets the road, it's kind of like, oh well, we weren't expecting that, and so that's been a difficulty. We've found a good church for now, but integrating our daughter has been a challenge. Prayers for that. Any thoughts that anyone has, I'm all ears. So I'll stop there for now. I would rather talk about Dr. Brandt and finally give a proper introduction. So I was asked to introduce Dr. Brandt. I suspect just because I go to Oxford and Dr. Brandt is at Oxford. We actually hadn't met before this. I mean, we met before this, but the more that I looked into not only Dr. Brandt, but the work that he's doing, the parallels between our passions are pretty remarkable, and I don't think that was actually foreseen by those that wanted me to introduce him. So Dr. Brandt, see if I got this right, did an MA, MPhil, DPhil, all at Oxford. His supervisor at Oxford was one of the most well-known Kierkegaard scholars in the world, so I'm super jealous about that. His dissertation was on the possibility of revelation, beginning with Paul Tillich. Possibility of revelation in film. So I know that speaks to a lot of people that are interested in bringing the arts to culture. The chaplain at Oxford for 15 years, the director of the Oxford Character Project, which is super fascinating. But to sort of tee up where Dr. Brandt is going to go with this project called New Renaissance. When I first learned about the work that they're doing, I immediately saw not just parallels, but a ton that AFTE and the New Renaissance can be doing together. But it reminded me of my own faith journey, which began before I had any interest in doing anything with God. I was just sort of raised, I just sort of drank the culture, which was that if I wanted answers to anything, if I wanted knowledge for anything, I should go to my current culture, basically. I mean, that wasn't exactly explicit, but that really came to a fore when I went through a 2-year bout of major anxiety, panic attacks, this sort of thing, and went to my culture, went to anything contemporary and current for answers, and just found nothing. And it wasn't until I started looking at sort of ancient philosophers that I started finding sort of answers for the first time. Then it wasn't until I looked to Jesus and found, it's where everything was pointing. I didn't realize it. But ever since then, I was just shocked then to learn that most of the knowledge and wisdom that I was looking for was to be found in the ancients. That was a shocker to me. And ever since then, in one sense, I've been wanting to bring that treasure back out to our culture today, and that's part of what I do at Philosophy Pub Night. And it's a beautiful thing. And so that said, I'll hand that over to Dr. Brandt, who's working on the New Renaissance project, and he'll say Renaissance correctly.
What I would love to do together this morning, what I would love for us to do together this morning is to really have a conversation. I said last night, I'll say it again, that it does feel like an incredible privilege to be invited into this community. And there is such wisdom and experience around the room. That for me to sort of stand at the front and declaim for 30 or 40 minutes and then give you a few minutes for questions or whatever seems like a huge waste. So I hope I'm not being totally selfish when I suggest that the way in which we're going to run that is I'm going to speak on this New Renaissance project and some of the thinking behind it in kind of broadly 10-minute chunks. And then I'm going to turn it over to you and invite you to talk together in small groups. I have to admit, when I first thought of this, I was imagining the tables, up in the AFTE room up there, that you could just have table conversations. But I do note that here we have nice swivel chairs, so it's still possible to turn around. So there'll be opportunities for you to talk together and then feed back some of your thoughts. And I hope we can think and we can learn together. Actually, both Michael's last comments on the op-eds and Michael's talk about anxiety and what's going on in our generation are a perfect setup for this. So let me begin. The New Renaissance Project, I was hired by Wycliffe Hall about 2 years ago to head this project up, which is really the brainchild, the passion project, the vision of our principal, Michael Lloyd, who some of you, I think, will know. And essentially, as we heard in, I thought, a really remarkable prophetic message from Alma this morning, we live in challenging times, a period that I think we would all recognize as being characterized by global turmoil, political polarization, and to go to Bren's point, personal anxiety. And so some are saying that we as Christians should retreat. We might think of the very influential book by Carl Dreyer a few years ago now, talking about this sense that actually we should just batten down the hatches, pull back, school our own children, have our own communities, and just wait for the storm to pass. And clearly, we need strong Christian communities. Others are looking for a kind of political restoration, perhaps imagining that there is, a kind of pristine, more Christian time in the past that we need to work our way back to. And obviously, we want faithful women and men working in the political sphere, from the smallest kind of community organizing up to the great positions of state. But I'm not sure that's the answer. Others are looking for revival, and certainly in the UK, we're talking now a bit about whether there is a quiet revival going on, that there is a substantial cultural shift, perhaps going again to Brent's point about that woman in Denmark, where people have not explored Christianity before, and they're willing now to think about it in a way that perhaps they weren't in the past. And we certainly want to pray and preach and do everything in our power to see a revival and hundreds, thousands, millions coming to faith in Christ. But as I say, at Wycliffe, we sense a particular call, which is towards a new Christian renaissance. And that's what I would love us to talk together about this morning. And I guess, sort of visually, metaphorically in our minds, we have some of those healing, life-giving rivers that we see in Scripture that seem to flow out from the places where God meets with his people and bring restoration and healing and new life and purification to vast geographic areas. So as we talk together this morning, I called it a lecture, but I'd much rather say conversation. These are the kind of three areas that we're going to look at. What do we mean by a renaissance, and what drives a renaissance? I admit it, that makes it sound like a new car brand. It's the Renault Renaissance. But that wasn't quite what I had in mind. And then a Christian renaissance, and surely that's important. What makes what we do truly Christian? And just one way of thinking about that this morning, thinking about the resurrection, surely the center and the heart of Christian faith. And then finally, at the end, I'll come back to a bit more about what we're doing at Wycliffe and invite some ideas from you as to what you're doing in your various contexts. So, what do we mean by renaissance? Or renaissance, or however you put the emphasis. The term was first used in the sense, or beginning to develop the sense that we have today, by a French historian called Jules Michelet, was writing. This was in volume 7 of his vast history of the French peoples. And essentially, he was looking back about a half a century in time and saw the French Revolution as a time of kind of the reformation of the French people. And he called that a Renaissance. It was picked up by a Swiss, again, a historian called Jacob Burckhardt, just around the same sort of time. And he was the first to talk of that kind of 15th century Florentine Italian Renaissance. And then certainly within the English language, a scholar based in Oxford called Walter Pater wrote an incredibly influential book at the end of the sort of 19th century and began to talk about all the things that sort of characterize the sort of pop culture view of the Renaissance today. So that led to this kind of archetypal sense of what happened in Florence and other parts of Italy, latterly in the lowlands, etc., in the 1400s, as what we mean by Renaissance. But since then, scholars have also projected the term sort of backwards in time from that point and looked at things like the 12th century, and particularly the role of the kind of Islamic scholarship, recovering some of the, the ancient Greek thinking and bringing that in, back a little bit further to the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, with Alcuin of York heading up great educational reforms there, and all the way back to Northumbria and the northeast of England in the sort of 7th and 8th centuries. And it does continue to have cultural resonance today. So, first opportunity for input. Why have I, or who have I got up here, and why have I got them up here? Yep, we've got the name of the first one. We have Beyoncé and Macron, Emmanuel Macron of France. Obvious, so this, I don't know, depending on where you come in your sort of cultural references. So Beyoncé, her last global world tour was called the Renaissance Tour. And Macron's political party that he sort of reformed about 4 or 5 years ago is called the Renaissance Party. But what I would love you to do for the first time now, just in small groups, 2s, 3s, 4s, however it works where you're seated, is just to chat together. How do you feel about the word Renaissance? What's your instinctive response, your gut reaction to that? Do you find it inspiring, irrelevant, alienating? Why? Just a few minutes chatting together. Off you go. Okay, we were just looking for some sort of hot takes here. So what I'm going to do is Brent and I are going to take some microphones around and try and pick up a few comments from the groups of how you respond to this term. Okay, Can we get a group or somebody who's willing to say something about how they responded to this word Renaissance? Put a hand in the air.
Raise a hand. Here we go.
Fantastic.
Jonathan Crabtree. So I actually really like the term Renaissance. It's how I describe the, occasionally I get to bartend where I work, and so I get a lot of visitors come from out of town, and I get to tell them about the economic and societal renaissance that's happened in downtown Meridian the last 10 years. Some other people in Meridian tend to call it an economic revival, but I think Renaissance assumes that new things are popping up, as opposed to revival is the restoration of something old or dying, and yes, there is new life in it. Renaissance, I think, assumes that there is a completely new outlook on something, such as the brewery that I work at. We restored the building. It was an old building, dilapidated. We restored it, but now downtown Meridian has a new concept of what it means to hang out in a societal place to form community around this brewery or the pub. And so that's why I like the term Renaissance.
Fantastic. And you've actually jumped ahead to the next conversation point, which is around, have we seen examples of it? So that's fantastic. And people sometimes ask me, what's the difference between revival and Renaissance? So I'm happy with that.
Thank you. I'm Joy Moore. Hello. So having said my name, I'll say mine first and then share hopefully in a sentence, my groups. I just love the way you say Renaissance. But a reminder that the moment we're living in right now feels like the not right moment, but maybe the exact right moment to be using this word and recovering this idea. But because it's often thought of politically or philosophically, I think the point that our group said that is probably the one I'd like for the whole group to hold is a curiosity about how you're going to say Christian Renaissance.
Thank you, Joy. That was really helpful. One or two more, and then we'll move on. I have one here.
Thanks. Laura Dahl. I shared with my group about a week ago, I would have said I had very positive connotations with it, but I just read David Nay's book, The Quest to Save the Old Testament, and he looks at how the Renaissance contributed to the denigration of the Old Testament as scripture in the life of the church, because this retrieval of ancient Greek and Hebrew texts led to this antiquarianization of scripture. It historicized it, so it's like a relic to be studied in a museum rather than something that is living with authority for the church today. And so it made me think of, there's kind of a ditch on the side of the road in a Renaissance, because it's, in what way is it being retrieved?
Thank you, Laura.
We're here.
Ali Schulman. My first instinct was actually, to me, the word is so geographically limited in Europe, in my imagination, that it's quite difficult for me to hold on to it as an American. But I think the idea of comparing it with, originally revival appeared more in my lane, but I think that the point that a revival is kind of enthusiastic moment in time versus Renaissance being a longer standing thing is an interesting idea. However, the concern of it being kind of a Western Eurocentric term is still something that hangs in my head when I'm thinking about that word. So.
Fantastic. Those were really helpful responses. And I guess I always want to ask that question, because when Michael Lloyd, our principal, sort of employed me to run this, I said, I love this project. I love the vision that you have to see the name of Christ raised, see the church and the Christian community engage in culture much more effectively than we have done for decades, if not centuries. But let's not call it the Renaissance project. Because you have a period from sort of Walter Pater at the end of the 19th century through to perhaps the 1970s when it was essentially, in Europe at least, I don't know about the US, celebrated. But any book that you pick up since then that talks about the Renaissance is much more going to the kinds of things that you were talking about in recognizing the ways in which this can be incredibly Eurocentric, is very hard to disentangle from colonialism and empire. There are lots of negative connotations. But nonetheless, something, I think, about this sense that we need a rebirth, that we need to see, what is good and true and beautiful about the Christian faith reintroduced to culture in the kinds of terms and media which they can engage and understand and be moved by. That feels to me like something which is important. But we come back to this question, I think it was Joy's and Joy's groups, what is going to make this a Christian Renaissance? And I think that's really key. So in this next section, I just want to use one example of Renaissance to suggest something that we've seen is that if we wanted to see this, it requires scholarship, leadership, arts, and culture. And we could talk about Florence in the 15th century, but as a kind of more discrete, manageable example, I wanted to talk, and this is perhaps pure bias on my part, about the United Kingdom, and particularly about a small area in the northeast of what is now England, and around this area, two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira, which came together as the Kingdom of Northumbria. And we have some famous names you might see up there like Lindisfarne, but particularly what I'm thinking about is centered on what were two monasteries along the river here in Jarrow and Monk Wearmouth. And in this place, we saw remarkable scholarship, with perhaps the prime example being who is sometimes known as the Venerable Bede, a scholar of absolutely remarkable breadth. And of course, we have to remember then that a great library in that time probably held sort of 40 to 100 volumes, so it wasn't quite like going into the Bodleian or the main Duke Library here. Nonetheless, incredible ability across a wide range of everything from mathematics through to sort of engagement with ancient texts. And Bede and other scholars with him, along with the other things that were taking place, managed in this period to shift what someone like Charles Taylor might call the social imaginary of these English Anglo-Saxon people from a self-perception as pagan warring tribes to a Christian people with a part to play in the purposes of God. We might return to that in a minute and perhaps complicate it, but something remarkable happened in this period, and there's no doubt that the scholarship of people like Bede were a huge part of it. Leadership was obviously also at the center of what was going on. And interestingly for me, there were many different kinds of leadership expressed. Some of it we might think of as a kind of risk-taking, pioneering leadership. And I have up here a stained glass window of a young noblewoman, in fact, a princess called Bertha of Kent. And she was really a waymaker for the first Latin missionaries coming in to the United Kingdom in Canterbury a century or so before this period. And it was her willingness to risk her social position as somebody who'd come from the continent with Christian faith into a pagan kingdom, but to introduce the missionaries that made everything that came after possible. So that risk-taking, pioneering leadership. There were also people like St. Cuthbert, who expressed a kind of moral leadership, a kind of virtue that was transformative to people that encountered him and even to people that read about his life. And then finally, there was a kind of what we might think of as institutional or perhaps more managerial leadership. And this is a man called Benedict Biscop, who set up those monasteries that I showed on the slide a few moments ago, where the Venerable Bede and many other people spent their lives and were given what they needed in order to do that kind of groundbreaking, culture-shifting scholarship. And in a homily on a Founders' Day feast, looking back to their founder, Benedict Biscop, Bede said this: "He worked so zealously that we are freed from the need to labor in this way. He journeyed so many times to places across the sea that we, abounding in all the resources of spiritual knowledge, and essentially that was books which he brought back with him, can, as a result, be at peace within the cloisters of the monastery with secure freedom to serve Christ. And there's a kind of leadership which often is hidden, even invisible, that's not flashy, but actually establishes the conditions for other people to do important work in service of Christ. And so again, it's amazing to have so many deans and sort of leaders of institutions here who perhaps don't get to do the big new monograph, but are creating the conditions whereby others can. And I think that kind of leadership is essential if we're going to see any valuable form of transformation. And then, of course, culture and the arts. This is one of the carpet pages from the Lindisfarne Gospels that brought together, sort of Islamic styles of art, Celtic styles, and Latin in some remarkable things. And then somebody who's known as, I think it says here on this, as the kind of the father of English sacred verse, a man called Caedmon, who I would love to tell you more about because I resonate with him as somebody who didn't believe he had any musical giftings whatsoever, but a sort of an encounter with an angel transformed Caedmon. That hasn't happened to me yet, but you never know. But it turned out that his delightful renderings turned his hearers from delight in wickedness and inspired them to love and do good. A powerful example of the creative arts at work in service of God and his kingdom. So this may come back to the very first comment of Jonathan's, but next, quick discussion. Where have you seen signs of Renaissance in your context or perhaps further afield as you've been traveling? And are Christian scholarship, leadership, arts, and culture contributing in any way to what's going on? Again, a few more minutes chatting together about that. That's fun. Yeah, that's great. Okay, I hope that we're just igniting a few sort of conversational themes that you might be able to pick up and continue through the rest of our time together. But is there one group, one example which has come up in conversation that you would just like to share briefly with the whole group? Was there somebody who just thought, wow, somebody in my group just shared something that was fantastic, everybody should hear? One, here we go.
So as you were speaking, I was thinking of this when Mr. Rogers received his Lifetime Achievement Award. At the end of the speech, he says something like, the challenge for those of us in television is how do we make what is good attractive? Because we can take television to lead people to evil or to something good. So that had come to my mind as you were speaking. And then I just began to think of Renaissance in relationship to The Chosen, and how many people have just, I was telling them, my ministry students apologized to me. I'm so sorry, Wendy, but I really love The Chosen. I'm like, well, why are you apologizing? Right? There's something really beautiful in seeing Jesus interact with these disciples and relating to the disciples and seeing the beauty, I think, in television.
Because I was referencing this, we kind of stuck with the arts and culture contribution, and Fujimara, I'm going to say his name wrong, Mako, Art and Faith, and then Martin Shleski, I'm saying his name wrong too, the sounds of life's unspeakable beauty. Those two books are particularly incredible ways in which, through visual art, musical art, and culture, the Christian goodness is being revived in the world.
Thank you both. I'm going to move on, but as I say, hopefully these conversations can continue, and I certainly would love to hear about anything that you've seen, which we might be able to learn from. So moving on to that really key question, a Christian Renaissance. And one way of thinking about that is to think of the power of the resurrection. How can what we do be shaped, informed, transformed by the resurrection? And at one level, that is almost a kind of, a trivial truism that, what is Christianity without the resurrection, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15. But specifically, how might we think about the way scholarship, leadership, arts, and culture are underwritten, shaped, and empowered by the resurrection? So just some really quick thoughts, and there's one of these that we'll land on to talk a little bit more together. But as I was reflecting on this, something which I'm sure has struck many, many of you, but had never struck me before, is the way in which the resurrection, or certainly the gospel accounts of encounters with the resurrected Christ, dignify human learning and investigation. Thomas. We might also think of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then the breaking of bread, and it all comes together. But they have to put it together. We might think of Mary in the garden, almost like a sort of scientific, kind of what they sometimes call abduction. She has a hypothesis. It's the gardener. She gets some new data when he says her name in that inimitable way, Mary. And then she gets a much better conclusion, Rabbi, Master. It's revelation, but with the gospel is so powerful. The resurrection is such a unique world, reality transforming event, so cataclysmic that we might imagine it sort of overwhelming the need for human effort and investigation and thinking and engagement. We might imagine it would just come by sort of, undeniable, instantaneous revelation. But it doesn't work that way. We see Jesus presenting himself in such a way that the disciples work their own way towards him. And I think whether you're an academic, a teacher, or somebody who simply uses the tools of human thought and reason in engineering or whatever it might be, there's something in the way in which that works which dignifies that kind of human activity. So the resurrection, I think, says something about the importance of scholarship, broadly conceived. And then the resurrection and leadership. Again, a really obvious point. It matters who was raised. A lot of my background, Brent mentioned this, is in film. So if I'm thinking about presenting, I tend to think, well, what films can I use that might be useful in this thing? And so I went onto the Internet Movie Database, typed in resurrection for film titles, and quite a lot popped up. But they were almost all like this one, Alien Resurrection. There was Zombie Resurrection and Halloween Resurrection. And it was almost always kind of depraved, evil characters coming back from the grave to get revenge on who it was who had put them into the grave the first time. Well, that's not hugely helpful. But actually, it does say something about this. It matters who was raised. And I say this is St. Anselm of Canterbury, obviously wrote that remarkable piece of kind of philosophical theology, Why the God-Man? But I think some of the ways that that's been taken up and interpreted gives you this idea of the resurrection almost as like a sort of piece of machinery. But if you get the right inputs and you feed them in, that kind of divine human hybrid, and you sort of have sinful, evil people put them to death, then almost like clockwork, a kind of resurrection will pop out the other side. And it just, it becomes a mechanism. But it's about a person. It matters who was resurrected. And this is, an opportunity for me to talk about someone that I take every opportunity I get to talk about, a remarkable 20th century minister, a chaplain in the First World War, a poet and a theologian called Godfrey Anquetil stood at Kennedy. And he has this amazing passage about Jesus, which even though we're short on time, I'm tempted to read. But at its center is just saying he broke every category. He was a mad fanatic who played with children. He was a morbid Puritan who declared war on natural instincts and was called a glutton and a wine-bibber and a friend of harlots. He was a ridiculous visionary with his eyes fixed on heaven, who was always telling people that their first duty was to love one another and do good in this world. He was a megalomaniac madman who was always talking about himself as king of heaven and always thinking about other people and living the simplest and humblest life of kindly service. He made himself equal with God and forgave the men that spit upon his face. It matters who was resurrected because he was resurrected to the ultimate position of power and authority in the universe, the ultimate leader, you might say. And so any kind of Christian leadership must take its cues from that. And that is something that we find incredibly hard to do. And Rowan Williams, so often speaking on the nose on these matters, says this. And actually he says it in reference to Bede and some of Bede's blind spots and unconscious biases, we might say, when he was talking about that remarkable movement. And Rowan Williams says this: it leaves the properly unresolved question of how a non-violent faith, whose greatest figures are those who renounce the obvious means of power, can become such a shaping force in society without losing its integrity and turning into yet one more competitor for cultural control. And I think I'll just throw this one out for you to think about as we go away. But how do we, as Christians, as the people of God, avoid losing our integrity and turning into yet one more competitor for cultural control when we're trying to get things done in the name of a very famous business management book? Whether it's we want to see an institution transformed or the locality where we're living, how do we do that without simply taking up the usual tools of cultural capital, of sort of change management in this broken world? I think that's not a question that we're going to solve, even if I gave you 10 minutes to talk this morning. But I think it's one that's worth taking away with us. But before we finish, I do want to say something really quickly, a little bit more about the arts and culture, and then even more quickly about what we're up to at Wycliffe Hall. In arts and culture, Christian arts and culture, I think we should see something of the irrepressible hope of the resurrection. A hope that Peter talks about, a living hope through the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Something that I think relates to a very remarkable lecture actually it was, by Tolkien on fairy stories, when he uses this kind of neologism, a new word that he comes up with, the eucatastrophe. Who's heard of that one? Basically that kind of good sort of twist in the conclusion when he says that actually any true fairy story does have a happy ending. It may not be true of great, sort of drama where maybe tragedy is important, but a fairy story should have that kind of an ending. And he says, it's a remarkable sort of piece of writing, this story has entered history and the primary world, not just the world of the fairy story. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. And so I talked very briefly last night about a novel called Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, which, if you set aside lots of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, is a remarkably humane portrait, I think, of marriage and Christian love and commitment, or failure to commit to the other. But it ends, as I said last night, in the void, the darkness, the loveless kind of eternity ahead. Another book which was published at not dissimilar times, slightly more recently, but was, sort of published by, the major kind of secular publishers, reviewed in all the same journals, by a man called Francis Spufford, is called Light Perpetual. And you could say that Light Perpetual is even more clear-eyed in its kind of depiction of some of the horrors of our world and some of the cruelties that we do to one another. It actually begins with 5 children being blown up and killed in 1942 in London in a Woolworths store, of all places, when a German V-2 bomb landed on them. And the novel is essentially a reimagining of what those lives might have become had they been able to live. And the book finishes, again, very clear-eyed about the world that we inhabit, in a hospice, where one of the characters is coming to the end of his life. And it has a sort of passage which I think has at least a hat tip in it to T.S. Eliot, which says this: "Mightn't there be a line of sight, not ours, from which the seeming cloud of debris of our days, no more in order than, say, the shredded particles riding the wave front of an explosion, prove to align into a clock face of transparencies? This whole mess arose, a window." And the book closes. But there's a final chapter. You turn on 2 more pages to a chapter of just 2 words. The words are, "Come, dust." It's an allusion to the general resurrection, that this is not the end of the story, that there is someone who can put right what is wrong and broken. And I think Christian arts and cultures have a grip on hope that nobody else can hold on to in the same way. I guess a balancing point, if there's a besetting sin, I think, of Christian arts and culture, it might be moving towards that happy ending too quickly and too easily. And we need to learn from some of the greats. And one of those is Dostoevsky. And as many of you will know, he was profoundly impacted by this painting of the crucified, of the dead Christ in the tomb by Hans Holbein the Younger. He saw it in a museum when he was traveling, fleeing actually gambling debts. And he wanted to look reality in the face before jumping to easy answers. Coming back to Williams, he has said, you do not find fundamentalist novelists, only what you would have to call fabulists, writers of narratives with closed significance. We need people who are like Dostoevsky. And an essayist called Frank Guan has written this. Dostoevsky enacts the rigorous and ruthless crash testing of his Christian convictions against existing social reality, but with a confidence, maybe a hard-won confidence, maybe a delicate and fragile confidence, but that there is hope in the end. And I think if we're going to see a new Christian renaissance, we need to have confidence in our faith, confidence that's willing to work through the difficulties before coming to the eucatastrophe of the happy ending and hope. So the New Renaissance Project has shared endeavor as we close. We feel that God has placed us at Wycliffe Hall in a unique sort of institutional location, in that we are both a worshiping Christian community that starts each day in prayer and worship and scripture, and a part of the University of Oxford, one of the world's great brands. And certainly there is a sense that exciting initiatives often happen from people and institutions at the margins of major institutions. It's that place where innovation and the possibility for impact come together. So we are hoping with this project that we can do what we can to foster transformational scholarship, leadership, and culture born out of Christian community, offering the truth, beauty, and goodness of the gospel to the world. And if we could work together on a project like this, how might the world be different? It would be fantastic, wouldn't it, if more of the wicked problems of our time were addressed by Christian scholars offering research-led solutions. If more of our institutions were headed by Christian leaders of good character with a vision for the coming of the kingdom. If artists were infusing more of the truth, goodness, and beauty of the gospel into all aspects of our cultural life. And all of this would have to be catalytic, inspiring, and resourcing other Christians around the world, and hopefully bringing glory to Christ. And of course, that's going to require that we remember that not only is there the light that shines out of darkness, the light which has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, but we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. So as you go away, if Frederick Buechner is correct, and your vocation in life is where your greatest joy meets the world's greatest need, then what Renaissance project might God be calling you to? Something for you to think about. And if you'd like to learn more about what we're up to, there's a QR code there, and you can hear something of what we're trying in the very early days of our work at Wycliffe Hall. Thank you.
Yeah, great.